Hello, my name is Scott Coley, and I'm here at Quaker Meadows and would like to welcome you to the Charles McDowell House. I am a board member of Historic Burke Foundation that is the owner of this property, and I'm also a member of the Over Mountain Victory Trail Association. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about swords and their importance during the American Revolution. There was a sword that after the Battle of Kings Mountain that was presented to Colonel Charles McDowell of Quaker Meadows, and that sword is today on display at the North Carolina History Museum in their permanent collection. So if you're in Raleigh, you can see that sword. But the reason that they were so important was that it was a status symbol of its time, and it had been kind of replaced as a serious fighting weapon by the bayonet, which at Kings Mountain was used 3 times to relieve the Tory forces, and was a more feared and regarded deadly weapon than a sword at the time. But if you saw a man wearing a sword, you knew that it was a person that had some seniority or some type of ownership, or they were an officer in an army, and they had different types of uses. This was a cavalry sword, and it's an English sword that dates to this time of the American Revolution, and is the type that the dragoons, like under Bannister Tarleton, who was defeated at Cowpens, would have had. And this particular one is kind of neat because it has the quillen end in the guard was bent back, and that was really just to give the soldier more leverage when he was slashing with the sword, because it was a slashing weapon. And it also has a hole in the guard where you would tie a rope through it, that's called a sword knot, and tie it to your hand so that if you lost your sword, it would not literally fall on the ground. You would still have it with you as you're riding your horse. The rest of these weapons are for a foot officer or a gentleman of the time, and this one here is called a small sword, these two, and these are both English, and this one has a coin silver hilt, and this is not a weapon that would have been used potentially in a warfare situation. It was more to show the status of the person who owned it. And this one in particular, at the time you would take your coins to a silversmith, and the silversmith would make a teapot or something with it, such as this sword hilt. And what that showed is that you had more money than you needed, basically, because you could afford to take your coins and turn them into something else that was beautiful. And it also was sort of a bank, because you could take that and sell it for its weight in silver if you needed the money out of it. So it was sort of an interesting thing that a lot of people inherit teapots and so forth, and the reason they saw them as being so important to their family was because it was literally a lot of times their money that was in them. This sword is the only one that I know for sure would have been in the American Revolution here, and it's because it is has marked on the end here where it has the rank of the person that had it, and it's engraved in the guard what regiment the person was in, and it was also says the Lancashire Militia on one side, and the Lancashire Militia was raised in order to come and fight in the American Revolution. So we know that sword came over in the Revolution and then went back to England because it was purchased from an antique dealer in London. So that one made it back. This next one is a German sword, and during the American Revolution we had a lot of Germans that had come here, that immigrated, and they fought as patriots, but we also had Hessian soldiers that came fought with Cornwallis, and this would have been a Hessian officer sword, and it was made specifically by a swordsmith for someone that wanted something fancy, and it has gold wash on the blade, so it would have been a pretty expensive item to have bought. Definitely not something that would have been issued to him by the military. And then it's got a lion head pommel here on the end, which the lion was a show of strength and a symbol of the time period that was important, especially when it came to military and that kind of thing. This sword is an American sword, and it's a short saber and has a shell guard, and would have been similar to what would have been used during the French and Indian War prior to the American Revolution, and it has a walnut handle, and the guard has been cut, and I think that because of the way that it was done, it was because it had a little piece like this that went around it, and that was removed probably because the person using it didn't like it. It didn't feel good with his hand, so he had it professionally removed. So it now just has this, it comes to an end here, but originally would have had a long guard. So that was changed just like this in order for the soldier that was using it to have a better grip and be able to maneuver the sword better. This type of sword is called a spadroon. Is the type that an officer on the field would have had, and in the British Army, and was actually a German pattern, and the English Army adopted it because King George, of course, was German, and he had gotten all these Hessian soldiers to come over here and fight and so forth, and it was just a very good, usable weapon. These two swords, this is a Scottish small sword, and this is a French small sword. And one fun story about this French one is that it's in a book that George Newman wrote, who wrote a book on swords blades of the American Revolution. And he, in his description, he lists that it's a silver hilt. So like this one, it has silver in it, but at the time that we read the description in George Newman's book that it had silver hilt, it was completely black, and silver turns black when it oxidizes. So this was cleaned and realized that it has silver wire between each band of steel, and then it has a silver wash over the whole thing, which was unknown until that was read about in the book. So that was kind of a neat find after the acquisition of the sword. And then the last sword on this display is a Scottish sword, and it dates to it's earlier, like it's around 1700. So it's potentially could have been used even at the Battle of Culloden when the Scots had their last Jacobite rebellion, and a lot of those Scots came to North Carolina after that battle because they were forced to, and by the English, and this sword could have been used in the American Revolution by a Scottish officer, or it could have been who were here. They had Highland regiments with them, as well as there were people, as I said, that had come over from earlier times from Scotland that could have been a family sword that was brought over to America prior to the Revolution. But this particular sword was bought in Europe, in England, so it probably if it came to the American colonies, it would have gone back at some point to Britain. So that is the oldest sword, and it's got a basket hilt on it. And a basket hilt was used to defend yourself. So you had this large basket, and you could block another weapon with it. And then the end of a sword is called a pommel, and that one's particularly large, so you could literally hit somebody with the pommel end. You could use the long sword blade to strike someone, or you can stab with it. These small swords are strictly for stabbing, so it's more like in this lower picture, it has two gentlemen with their 18th century hats like mine. Fencing, and that was more of a use for stabbing and so forth. And then these swords that have the longer shaped blades are more of a slashing weapon. But that kind of gives you a little feel for what swords were in the American Revolution. As I said, they were not the most feared weapon, but they were certainly the weapon that showed who people were and what their status was when people saw them out in town or on the battlefield in the 18th century. But thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope you have a wonderful day and enjoy Quaker Meadows.